say. The problem with that is that best scholarship shows him in complete harmony with the teachings of Yeshua. The problem is that he himself demonstrates right to the end of his life, as much as it's recorded in Acts, that he himself is living by the Torah. Yes, in light of the new covenant. So I understand why people teach that Paul abolished the law, but it's a serious misconception based on several factors. Let me list about 5 points here. Number one, Paul, whose Hebrew name was Saul, took the message of the Messiah to the Gentiles without requiring them to follow the Torah. That's why some people think that he abolished the law. No, he understood that God had never called the Gentiles as separate nations and peoples to all come under Torah law. So he understood that he could take the message of the Messiah to them without requiring them to follow Torah. 2, Paul clearly explained that we are ultimately made right with God through faith, which is followed by a pattern of good works, rather than by our good works themselves, since none of us can fully live up to the law's requirements. Number 3, some of Paul's teachings are quite deep and complex and have therefore been misunderstood. 4, Paul emphasized how God had broken down the barrier that separated Jews from Gentiles, uniting them in one spiritual family. And 5, Paul clearly viewed the Torah from a different perspective in light of the inbreaking of the Messianic era. But this does not mean that Paul taught that the Torah was now null and void. To the contrary, Paul lived and died as a Torah-observant Jew, never taught that Jewish believers in the Messiah should abandon the Torah, although it appears that if taking the good news of the Messiah to the Gentiles meant that he sometimes had to break a certain law or tradition, such as a dietary restriction, then he would be willing to do that for the sake of their salvation. A principle that could even be deduced from rabbinic thinking as well. Rabbis would say that you can break the Sabbath in order to save a life, if especially a Jewish life. So let's say there's a situation whereby a friend of yours collapses and you've got to use your phone, whereas you normally wouldn't use it on the Sabbath, or you had to rush that person to a hospital and drive in a car, that even though, according to traditional Jewish law, that was a violation of the Sabbath, it would be acceptable to do so on the Sabbath. In fact, it would be imperative because of the command to save life. Paul, you can understand, with background and training in Pharisaical Judaism, would have no problem making a right deduction, let alone as a follower of the Messiah, that if I'm bringing the good news of salvation to the Gentiles, if I am bringing a message of life and death for them, whereby they can know God and be with him forever, if in order to do that, in order, let's say, to sit down and eat together and not break table fellowship and not reject these people, if I had to eat something I normally wouldn't eat to bring them the message of salvation, certainly that is a kingdom principle that he would have followed. But he never went and told Jews throughout the Torah, abandon it. And to repeat, with the temple destroyed, we have evidence of Jewish believers in Jesus continuing to live Jewish lifestyles that were recognizable enough to the church as a whole, the growing, emerging church as a whole, that they were Jewish. We also know from some of their writings that have been preserved among some of the ancient authorities that there was a definite separation coming with the traditions of the rabbis, that there was a definite dichotomy that was being formed there. Well, didn't Paul say that Jesus was the end of the law? Romans 10:4, Christ is the end of the law to all who believe. Let's just turn there. Again, I'm not going to look at every verse. I just want to give you a few principles. The book of Acts presents Paul to us living by the Torah. What does he mean in Romans 10:4, NIV, Christ is the end of the law so there may be righteousness for everyone who believes? Well, if you simply understand that the word end, telos in Greek, is often translated goal, end result. If you understand it in those terms, which many translators do, I have a whole book just on that phrase, which then refers you to hundreds of other books and articles dealing with it. Messiah is the goal of the law, or the end point goal of the law, so then there be righteousness for everyone who believes. He's not saying that he brings it to termination and irrelevance. He's saying he brings it to completion. It's pointing to him. And you'll find that in certain translations, especially those with a Messianic Jewish perspective. And he goes on to quote from Deuteronomy, not to say this is irrelevant, but to say we see this as ultimately pointing in the same direction. I'm just going to give you a list of verses without reading them that have been taken to speak of the law in a negative way. Ephesians 2:14 through 16. It speaks of Jesus abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. So in order to create in himself one new man out of the two, Jew and Gentile. Romans 3:20. There will be no one declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law we become conscious of sin. Romans 4:13 through 15. Romans 6:14. Sin shall not be your master because you're not under law, you're under grace. Romans 7:5 and 6. We've died to the law. We've been released from the law so that we can live, serve in the new way of the Spirit. Romans 7, 8, and 9. Romans 10:4, 1 Corinthians 15, 56 and 57. The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. Galatians 2, 15 and 16. All in your outline here. Galatians 3, 10 through 13. Quoting from Deuteronomy 27. And following Septuagint. Cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. Galatians 3, 23 to 25. We were held prisoners by the law before faith came. Galatians 5:4. You who are trying to be justified by the law, you've been alienated from Messiah. You've fallen away from grace. 5:18 in Galatians. If you're led by the Spirit, you're not under law. 1 Corinthians 7:19. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Repeat it in Galatians 6:15. Romans 2, 28, 29. The true Jew is one who's one inwardly, not outward circumcision, but inward. You read those verses and you say, well, so much for what you've been saying about Paul. Obviously, this guy had an issue with the law. Obviously, as wrote here, no observant Jew in his right mind would say such things. Even if Jesus didn't abolish the law, Paul did. That's why Christianity is not for Jews. We don't hate the law like Paul. We love it. Let's just remember 2 Peter 3:16, that Paul's letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant, unstable people distort as they do the other scriptures to their own destruction. Perhaps there's more to the story. Remember, Acts tells us how Paul lived. And I'm accepting the authority and testimony of the scriptures. Romans 2:13. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. 2:17 to 20 and 23. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? That seems to be quite a lofty understanding of what the law is all about. Okay, you're a Jew. You may think of yourself as more righteous than the Gentiles. This is the challenge that he's giving. Okay, you've got the law. Do you keep it? Romans 2:25, circumcision has value if you observe the law. Romans 3:1 and 2.